Hello, hello, and welcome to the Rock Metal Podcast. I'm your host, John Harris. Today on the Rock Metal Podcast, we have Amaranthe. They've got a new album called Manifest, which is going to be released on October 2nd via Nuclear Blast Records. Right now I'm being joined by Olaf. We're going to chat about this incredibly massive, huge-sounding album that they just recorded, and we're going to chat about a couple of tracks. We're going to chat about what the band has been up to. So, Olaf, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, John. It's a pleasure to be joining you.
Abso-freaking-lutely. Now, I guess because it's fresh on my mind, I just watched that documentary, or one of the pieces anyway, of the documentary that you guys had just done for the album, and there's a few questions that I just had that were just kind of fresh in my mind about that. Is the first album being done with Nils? Is that correct?
It's actually the second album. He did the Helix album was his first 2 years ago.
That's what I thought, and it kind of sounded like he said it was the first album, and I was like, is that true? So I was going to ask, what's that been like? But I guess maybe still, how's that been going with Nils? Second album through, I guess at this point, it's like nothing's changed.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that, but actually, I think what's a little bit confusing is that he was speaking a little bit about the whole thing as a new experience in the documentary. And what he was talking about basically was that while he was singing on the last album, he wasn't as big a part of the process as he was this time around. And obviously, me and Elise as songwriters, we have gotten to know his voice and, his vocal styles and what really works, with him, because obviously the guy has a vast range and he can do, Dio kind of singing, and he can do, power metal kind of singing, and even more aggressively. But he definitely sounds, fantastic when he's a little bit more towards, classic rock, actually. So we wanted to include a little bit of that influence. And Nils was also part of the mixing process, so he put a little bit of his fingerprint on the whole thing. So I will say that it was really cool to, just work a little bit more together with Nils on this album, actually. So in that sense, the process did change a little bit in regards to him.
Yeah. How did that affect everything? Because, obviously it still sounds like Amaranthe.
Yeah, but it's always really interesting. We do the same thing with Henke Morton and Joe and the other guys in the band as well, that we are, always receptive of their ideas and their opinions, even if it's me and Elise, practically writing all the music, basically. Then we always send it by the other guys, and they will say that, yeah, this sounds really cool, and maybe could try a little bit of this and that, and then we just ignore it, and then we go on. No, I'm kidding.
Well, that's a great idea. Next.
Yeah. This band is a lot like a family, so we love bouncing ideas back and forth in terms of pretty much everything, with this band. Me and Lisa are not interested in being, dictators of the whole thing and, be control freaks. So it's always nice to get in, this new vibe from Nils now, for example, and like with Henrik before, because everybody adds their own unique, specific flavor to the mix. So it's been very cool.
Cool. The thing I was mentioned was, the process had kind of changed a little bit, and something that came up was the drums. And you guys were constantly tuning drums, changing drum heads, getting more microphones in there, and the drum sound is massive. And then something else that you were chatting about with the guitars and the keyboards was, when they need to be complex, they'll be complex. When they don't need to be there, they won't be there. And if they need to be simple, they're just going to be freaking simple. And that really came across in the record. From the moment I heard Fearless, I said, that is fantastic. That everything where it needs to be is exactly where it needs to be. But I kind of always got that vibe from you guys, that you knew what to do and where to do it. So I'm kind of curious to take us maybe through that bit of the process into the engineering that went into the record.
Yeah, just like you mentioned, I'd like to approach things a lot more from the perspective of a composer and, a producer, or at least a co-producer as well, instead of just being the guitar player, that goes to the studio and gets his guitars recorded. And when it came to the recording process, it's actually something in terms of guitars that I always do myself, because I might be I'm not the kind of person who writes my riffs down to the exact detail months before I go into the studio. So what I actually do is that I take a pretty long time, like 1 or 1.5 weeks, and I have a basic idea of what I'm going to play, from the demos. But I actually sit in the studio, track myself, and I'm trying out a lot of different things. I'm actually composing at the same time as I'm recording, which is a really... it's kind of a spontaneous and also very creative process. It's just the way that I've always been working. So first, we have the drum recording, and there's a lot of people there, and then I get the studio for myself, for a week and a half or something like that. While recording vocals, it's a little more, traditional. This time, Johan actually recorded his bass in Finland because he couldn't fly to Denmark because of the corona situation. And us in the band, we also very barely made it down to Denmark since they closed the border just 40 minutes before we passed the border. So, in that sense, it was a bit of an, interesting recording process. But just like you mentioned, we also we were pretty open-minded when it came to the drums, and we were doing a lot of switching back and forth. Same thing with guitars. Because when we arrived there, even with the first day, we were saying that, yeah, guys, we might be stuck here for a very long time. Because this was mid-March, we had no idea if there was going to be, even worse of a situation than it turned out to be. I mean, of course, it's pretty bad. But I mean, Sweden could have completely locked down its borders, even for their own citizens or whatever. You just didn't know at the time. So we were saying that, okay, let's make sweet use out of all this time that we got.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's going to be one of my questions is, were you guys planning to make a record like this regardless, or was it the situation that allowed you to take more time?
Well, that was the thing, because obviously this is a disastrous situation for absolutely everybody globally. But I have to say that we've been, really, really lucky in terms of how things have been progressing for our band. Because we did a tour with Sabaton in Europe, an arena tour from January to middle of February it was. And we just managed to complete that before Corona really turned into a bad thing in Europe. And a month after that, we were supposed to enter the studio. So the only change in plans was that we had to leave 1 day earlier in order to pass the Danish border before they closed it. And I mean, the guys who were working on the train, they said that that you're going into a quarantine zone that's going to be locked down soon, right? And we're like all happy, like, yeah, we're just going to record a heavy metal album. No problem.
No issue.
So obviously when you record an album, I mean, for people who don't know how the process actually works, they might be thinking that there's a lot of people coming back and forth like a movie set or something. But yeah, you're actually usually only 2 to 3 people in the studio. And apart from that, you're completely isolated anyways. This small Danish village where we are recording is, on the countryside. So usually an album recording for us is complete quarantine anyways.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I was going to say, for the most part, from what I've seen in the footage anyway, it looks like it's just a couple of people at a time. And I mean, I've been in the studio with bands recording, and it's pretty boring unless you're actually doing something.
Yeah, exactly. It's not as exciting as some people would think. And it takes a long time also.
Yeah, the 7th time redoing the guitar part, like, okay, moving on to the next thing kind of thing.
Exactly.
Something that Elise said that I thought that was interesting was that the songs are in a lower key than usual, and some of the more topics on the album are significantly more serious. And speaking of which, Do or Die, the first ish single to come out, is a pretty serious topic. And something else you mentioned too was that the guitars are getting progressively heavier and more metal, and they're louder on the record. And I kind of thought that was a bit of hyperbole. And then when I heard the record, I thought, they did make the guitars louder. How do they do that? But I guess my question is, was that a conscious decision going into the record? Like, we're going to make it heavier, we're going to make it more metal, we're going to have lower keys, we're going to be more serious?
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely a conscious thing even before we started to write the songs themselves, actually, because we were just into that frame of mind, I suppose, because previously there's been a little bit more focus on the keyboards and the electronics, but I think it might be a natural consequence from playing, a lot live in the last, 8-9 years. And recently we've been playing some bigger places as well. And also, bigger festivals, and you just want that, chunky guitar tone to be a little bit of a, more central part in the band sound. And it's also cool, to underline to people that we are at heart, obviously a metal band and not some, super strange crossover thing. Even if we have a lot of crossover elements, which we really love, and we really still put a lot of emphasis on it, then I think, our identity and the way that we identify ourselves is, clearly rooted and focused in the metal scene. And I also think that it was a conscious decision for me as a guitar player, having played in a band called Dragonland before and still playing, which was very guitar oriented with lots of, 1, 2, 3 minute guitar solos. And I just wanted, my next project to breathe a little bit more musically and, just to develop your more, how should I say, diverse aspects of as a composer of metal music. But I think at the end of the day, the heavy guitars is just such a central part of, a great sounding album. And the last time that we were working on an album with Jacob Hansen with the Helix album, that guitar tone, I was thinking that, it sounds so good. And if I tune it down even a little bit more, it's going to be freaking awesome for the next album. So there's been that thought around for quite some time, actually.
Yeah. Was that complicated for the vocals?
No, not really, because instead of playing around with the volume, because usually, I won't say usually, but many metal bands, my own previous bands included, you try to pack as many things as possible at the same time. So there will be super heavy guitars playing technical stuff, and then will be vocals, heavy bass, drums, maybe a lot of keyboards, and then you try to balance this in the mix with a loud guitar sound. It's gonna squelch everything in the vocals, basically. So I try to approach it a bit more from, just like you said yourself, when there's, really important vocals, then usually the guitars take a bit of a backseat. Not so much in the volume, but might stop to play altogether, or just play something simpler, or just hold out the chords or something like that. So it's really important on, of how you approach an album as a composer to get the right result, production-wise. Because people seem to think a little bit that as long as you are great musicians and then you have a great producer, it's easy to get a really good sound. But it's really, really important that you write the music from the ground up to get a great production.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like you've done this before, Olof.
Once or twice. I think this was my 13th album. Lucky number 13.
Lucky number 13. Are there any? Why stop at a 3-minute guitar solo? Come on, give us 4 minutes. I mean. The entire song could be a guitar solo.
Thanks. I'll keep that in mind.
Beautiful. Now, I guess my next question is with regard to the keys being lower and going back to the vocal question. With balancing all 3 different vocalists, was changing the keys an issue at all, or was it easier for them to blend together? Or how did that impact just, I guess, maybe the way that each musician sings?
I will say that, Nils, as a male singer, has a phenomenal range. But obviously, Elise being a female, she can go extremely high. And she has a tendency to push herself a little bit when she's writing vocal lines. But since we were playing a little bit of lower keys, then it felt kind of natural for Elise to sing, just a slight bit lower. And that made it a little bit more possible for Nils. He could obviously nail it before, but he can put a little bit more nuance into it when he wasn't really, pushing it or pressuring his range as much as possible. So I think it was easy for us to put quite a bit of more Nils, in the choruses and in the harmonies, and also in his verses, actually. And that was also intentional because, he's definitely noticeable, in all his parts on the last album, the Helix album. But I just think that when you have 3 singers that are that good, you really want to make all of them shine, even if Elise is a bit front and center, arguably.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I think one of my other questions with regard to Jacob actually was, you guys have been working with him, I think, from the very beginning, correct?
Yep, correct.
I guess my question is, maybe it's a devil's advocate question, but have you guys considered trying a different producer?
The thing is that, the reason for trying a new producer is because you want to have a different sound. And, that can definitely be true, or a good thing, considering, which producer you're working with. But the really good thing with Jacob Hansen is that he's very diverse, and he's also constantly developing his own sound, plus that he understands what the band is trying to do, in terms of trying to do something different sonically. So he's always been part of our, musical and production-wise musical journey. and understands where we want to go. So I think that, if you compare an album like our third album, Massive Addictive, to our first album compared to the latest one, Manifest, they all sound very, very different. So for us, when we have such a great cooperation, it's instantly familiar. And he's also a very musical producer. He really understands vocal lines and, how to work with vocalists and, arrangements and all these things as well. So he's not really, coming up with a lot of specific ideas in terms of arrangements, but he understands how these should fit in sonically, into the production. So we really feel no need to abandon such a fantastically working concept. I mean,
exactly. When you say it like that, it sounds so bad. Now I just imagine Jacob with his cup of coffee and he looks sad. I don't want him to look sad.
Exactly. No, but to be honest, I've been working with a lot of, really, really top name producers, throughout the years before Amaranth. And while I loved working with them, there's just something with Jacob that just clicks with our music specifically, actually.
Okay. Very cool. Now, getting into the track Viral. Now, I read that this actually, the word viral has nothing to do with something that recently went viral, quite literally. But the music video is really quite fitting. So I guess maybe take us through that. Was it that you guys had a different plan in place for the music video for Viral, or did the music video, was it like, hey, this track is called Viral, let's make a music video for it about how we're breaking out of quarantine and we're playing our shows anyway, kind of, or is it a practice?
Yeah, I will actually say that I think about the time when it was time to start recording vocals, that's when we, the Corona crisis was at its, absolute height, in Europe. So for us to have a track like Viral, not actually redirect it a little bit towards the, towards the current situation, felt like, missing an obvious opportunity. And around the same time, we started to plan for the video as well, because we didn't really talk about the video concept before we entered the studio and before the whole, Corona shit, hit. So at that point, we were thinking that, since there's so much negativity in canceled shows and, everyone is, just feeling generally miserable about the whole thing, not the least, in the metal industry, then we wanted to, just put a little bit of a more positive perspective on the whole situation. So we were like, okay, so this is what it's going to be like in the future, when you can finally return to the stage, when you finally break free from this, social isolation, social distancing bonds, and kind of illustrating our frustration with being locked down, but, from a positive perspective instead of only complaining about it, because it is a shit situation for everyone, but it doesn't get any better if you're just getting depressed about it, of course.
This is very true, Olaf. You're the best person to talk to, first thing in the morning.
Awesome, man.
That's the first thing in the morning for me anyway, but
yeah, exactly. But we constantly try to be uplifting with our music in general. I think that this should go for this situation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I always dug the positive and the uplifting nature that you guys take, because a lot of times metal can be actually pretty depressing.
Yeah.
But not you guys, and I dig that, because I like metal and I like positivity, and you guys bring it together for me.
Yeah, and there's a million bands, obviously, who do that excellently. I mean, I don't really mind really sad, really somber, really depressive music, but there's already, thousands of bands literally that do that to perfection. So I don't think that the world needs another one, and this is where Amaranthe comes in, basically.
Beautiful. So take us through this album, Manifest. What are we manifesting, Olaf?
I mean, I think the central part of the whole thing, from the title considered, I think it's all about how me and Elise, we don't really squeeze out music. We don't really need to wait for inspiration. I mean, our music is something that is manifested, quite automatically. And also the title, I mean, it's also an adjective, something that is manifest, clear and obvious to the mind, basically. So it's kind of a, diverse title in that sense. And what we are manifesting is our, 100%, the vision for what Amaranthe should be. I think we were doing a lot of experimenting on mainly the third and the fourth album, and we're constantly, trying to develop our sound. But I think with the Helix album, it became a little bit more obvious for us what our direction should be. So we used the Helix album as a foundation to build, or as a how do you say? Yeah, foundation to build something quite massive on top of that, and just really taking it to the next level, and while also introducing some more influences. For example, I love to do compose film score style music, for example. So it was cool to introduce a little bit part of that, just, bits and pieces here and there. But at the end of the day, we do have a really strong musical vision. And this is really what we are trying to manifest with the album, what we are all about.
Mm-hmm. Dare I say, the best work yet, Olof.
Thank you very much. And I would have to agree from a very, very non-objective perspective.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right. Well, I believe that we have covered everything that I wanted to chat about. We weaved everything in there as far as, what you guys have been up to during coronavirus and what the album is about, and also as well some really cool things such as doing some different things on the drums, lower keys. You were doing some different things with the guitars and the keyboards, it sounded like. So I think that concludes all of my questions. If there's anything else that you wanted to throw out there, then let me know. Otherwise, Olof, thank you so much for coming on to the Rock Metal Podcast today.
Thank you very much, John. I'll just add that obviously we will try to see everybody. I won't say soon, but I will say instead as soon as possible on a tour, hopefully, next year. But let's see how the situation develops. And we'll be over to Canada and America before we know it.
Woo.